Hi, morning. And thank you also in turn, thank you Jorinta and thank you Anselm and all the beautiful backstage team for working on this. It's really a pleasure to think about these things that I'm going to talk today about and to show this film, which is a slightly newer film. I'm going to tell you a couple of things first about it so you can orientate yourself on our map. So my last film, this film, is called Остранение, or Estrangement. It was born out of sort of a deliberate linguistic misunderstanding, because in Russian, the word остранение can be translated as estrangement, as becoming estranged, or also as becoming a country. And so that comes from the similarity of the words strana and stranny. Estrangement was a term introduced by Russian literary critic Viktor Shklovsky in his essay Art as Technique. And he used it to describe, first of all, this what language does to meaning, but also art in general, how by using language unusually you can renovate the process of perception, how to radically relocate it, basically. So for me, this unknown territory was simultaneously becoming a country and becoming estranged was, at least in the terrain of language, was what led me think about several entanglements of histories. So Остранение is entanglement of histories of imaginary lands, where the shape of our world are used as a focal point in which geographical discoveries and human imagination and the technology, they all become sort of a whole for which we see how our point of view changed through time. Can we play the film now, please?
The history of our planet is a history of imaginary lands, brought forth by cartographers, travelers, and astronomers. You know this thick absurdity of human gaze, and any mapmaker is temporarily a demiurge. And the planet, being a comical protagonist that it is easily persuaded. In the 6th century BC, the Earth for the first time gave a break to the elephants and assumed a spherical shape. Pythagoras was very convincing. Plato referred to the image of the Earth with what would be deemed a remarkable precision from the contemporary point of view. In the first place, the Earth, when looked at from above, is like one of those balls which have leather coverings in 12 pieces and is of diverse colors. Ptolemy, with his famous map, considered the Earth to be sensibly spherical. In his geocentric times, it was still at the center of the universe, and a couple of continents were lacking from the map. The puzzle came together 16 centuries later, when in 1507 two German cartographers, Martin Wulzi-Müller and Matthias Ringmann, created a map of the world that brought together the traditional Ptolemaic view, with new discoveries by Amerigo Vespucci, Christopher Columbus, and others. The map firmly put the new continent in its place. The 1,000 copies quickly spread among the European universities. One ended up in the University of Krakow in 1512, where it found its way into the hands of Nicholas Copernicus. You know what happened next. Finally, a heliocentric universe and a couple of bonfires. Another exhibit in the Museum of Small Objects with Catastrophic Consequences. The first photograph of the Earth made from space. The photographic evidence didn't leave a chance to the unexplored lands, as well as to the monsters inhabiting them. Archimedes would say, finally, a lever long enough. In the contemporary economy of time and desire, all the needs are to be satisfied instantaneously, or even instinctively. Any Google Maps user often doubles as the universe's point of reference. As soon as you agree to allow location services access your personal data, the anthropocentric point of view literally wins. Dear passengers, the planet is at your disposal. The taxi application Uber favors the ETA over the route. The territory is therefore redefined in terms of radiuses of comfort. 5 minutes away, 10 minutes away, 15 minutes away. The very movement of the camera in Google Maps mimics the choreography of the toy-grabbing machine. Left, right, left, left, down, grab. The imagination begins to dull. Every image contributes to the creation of hyperreality, which substitutes the physical world. But the camera gaze on its own is innocent, and the photographic image retains its inherent ability to become strange again. For example, stock footage could claim the nostalgic position of unexplored lands from the maps drawn by medieval monks. The travelling itself was prohibited to them, but the pilgrimage through imagination and through other people's tales was still possible. The resulting world is about as realistic as Shakespeare's photograph. The world where words still hold power, as if the act of divine creation was still going on. The key words put into the search bar caused things to appear. Relaxed businessman putting his feet up in the office. Beautiful smiling woman pampering skin of face over white background. Group sitting on exercise balls, stretching resistance bands at the gym. Happy retired senior woman painting on canvas for fun at home. Dolly shot. A language which is authentic and selectively absurd. Words form the landscape. And landscape at times becomes ontologically difficult. For example, a fish tree world. The same contingency as complete Shakespeare's works typed out by monkeys. A land that one sees out of the train. In motion, but at the same time firmly bound by the window frame to the passenger's egocentric perspective. A land of duty-free perception. In one of the early myths, describing the world when it was still whole, the flat earth was covered by a mirror-like sky, which allowed people to see each other across great distance. Until a certain monkey saw her reflection and threw a stone at it, breaking the sky into pieces. One could put it next to the other myths of separation of languages, only the language is visual. Perhaps a myth of great estrangement. Easier to speak if you do not see.
Can you put the presentation, please? So, for the purpose of this talk, following that film, we need to imagine the following. If there is a map, we're not bent over a map like little Napoleons and looking over it. We're not even zooming in and out like we usually do, being in the center of it. But we're standing already somewhere inside the map, and we don't know where. Because the map has its own agenda, and the map has a mind of its own. The map is now concealing more things than it reveals, contradictory to its own definition. If we're to think about mapping as an always imperfect practice, in terms of the perfect map of Borges and this short story that I'm sure you're familiar with, of the story of the map, of the actual physical size of the empire that it depicts, maybe if we're to think about that, we should turn more to the essay, little essay of Umberto Eco about the same story, called On the Impossibility of Drawing a Map of the Empire on a Scale of 1:1, published in this delightful book. Eco, in great detail, explores the methods of production of the map, literally, and goes through the actual strategies of how this map could be made in real life. In consecutive, meticulous, and frankly quite hilarious attempts, he tries and rejects different methods. A opaque map sprayed over the territory like a tent, a suspended map, transparent map, extended and adjustable. The map, he argues, requires folding in order to be properly consulted. Because if the map is not unfolded, the subject wouldn't be able to tend the territory, which would deteriorate, making the map unfaithful. And of course, this endeavor, as Eco points out already in the title, is failure-bound, because to be truly an ideal map, even after all the considerations, the map has to include also itself. And he ends with three kind of corollaries. Every one-to-one map always reproduces the territory unfaithfully. The second one is, at the moment the map is realized, the empire becomes unreproducible, making itself imperceptible to its enemies and to itself as well. And the third one, every one-to-one map of the empire decrees the end of the empire as such, and therefore is the map of the territory that is not an empire. So why am I evoking this bizarre, frankly, proceedings? Because what I'm going to talk to you about, that is a methodology of the artist, involves the same kind of operation. What I imagine being inside the map, walking through it rather than looking at it from above, and experientially trying rather than knowing, embracing also failure and insecurity that ensues from it, and, well, spending some quality time in this confused state. So how do we conceive of filmmaking as movement through the map? I will speak to you briefly about my research first, as sort of a library before the film, and then I will share with you some of my own confusion, some notes on the film that I'm working on now. The surface aesthetics, the visuality of the film, comes from its constitution, and it is to say technological constitution, the configuration of particular elements and techniques at play inside the capturing and projecting apparatus. There is no way to completely eliminate the backstage machinery. Even the seeming absence of it tells something about how the film was made. And so behind the visible surface of the film, there hides another, I would like to think, backbone aesthetics, the concealed aesthetics of machinery with its own movements, structures, points of pressure, capture, and release. In terms of the original Greek meaning of aesthetics, something perceivable by the senses, this concealed aesthetics I'm talking about, of course, is less open to our eye than the image on the screen. Rather, it blends into the image and acts behind our perception, under our noses and as a presence rather than an acting body. It is through these barely discernible traces that a human mind reads the presence of some other, of something non-human, or at least mine does. Jean-Louis Comolli and Jean Narbonne, in their editorial in Cahiers du Cinéma in 1969, proposed to revert the understanding of classic theory of cinema of the time, that the camera is as an impartial instrument, and to suggest that every film is political inasmuch as it is a product of dominant ideology. Slightly later, in 1975, Jean-Louis Baudry also defines the inherent operations at work in the filmic apparatus as immediately already producing ideology. The movement that effaces the ruptures between still images and the perspectival framing of the work both work towards creating a subjectivity, presenting the filmic object as, quote, an intentional object implied by and implying the action of the subject which cites it, end quote. These social-political accounts of cinema, I would like to point out, reduce the technological apparatus to a mere means to an end. And as much as they had been an influence on film studies, there is no account of the experience and the process of the filmmaker in them. Baudry underlines specifically that the ideological mechanism at work in the cinema seems to be concentrated in the relationship between the camera and the subject, so the viewer. However, one quote, among others, from his article will help to denote these main problematics of my research. Concealment of the technical base will also bring a specific ideological effect. Its inscription, its manifestation as such, on the other hand, would produce a knowledge effect as actualization of a work process, as denunciation of ideology, and as critique of idealism. Baudry here refers to Althusser's distinction of knowledge and ideology, and I would like to point out the words concealment of the technical base and manifestation in this quote. The manifestation, or even unconcealment, if we were to call on that word here, is much more present in artistic work than in mainstream cinema. It is in the domain of art that the processes of subversion, questioning and challenging the technology take place, putting it on the foreground, as opposed to the classical model where the apparatus is always concealed. The artistic methodology is also the locus of embodied experience, especially so when the process of direct capture takes place, when you are the person holding the camera. This process allows to investigate spatial and durational peculiarities that come from the direct connection of the two bodies. And I will come back to that later, to the question of camera movement. So if we were to look at the artist's film as the main point of inquiry, what kind of technological engagement we can talk about? In the present moment of the cinematic apparatus, it's not longer neatly laid out as it used to be between the two techno bodies of camera and the projector and the space of the cinematic theater and the body of the viewer. The way it was present in film theory and heavily relied upon for a long time, such as in Vivian Sobchak's seminal account of phenomenology of film experience. We obviously noticed that CGI technologies and virtual reality, for instance, have again brought to light this perpetual question, what is cinema? And it's peculiar now to think about the short remark by Jean Renoir in the introduction to Bazin that, quote, that his writings will survive even though the cinema does not. Well, here they are. The attention towards radically changed technological dimension of the film has been visible in works of media archaeology scholars, where the history of cinema is seen as not as linear chronology, but more of an alternative genealogy, or topology even. Thomas Alsasser, for instance, asking not only what is cinema, but also when is cinema, and as I believe implicitly, where is cinema? If one can call the media archaeological accounts of technology in the way dispositives, concrete social apparatuses, then the experience of the artist still stays unaddressed. And here I'd like to turn to Rosalind Krauss' exploration of post-medium specificity. She rehearses the dispositive in the gallery space through the artistic practice of Marcel Broodhuijers in this book. She writes, "The filmic apparatus presents us with a medium whose specificity is to be found in its condition as self-different. It is aggregative, a matter of interlocking supports and layered conventions. Krauss accords more significance, complexity, and structure to the film apparatus itself, remarking on Marcel's practice as post-medium, not in the sense that it departs from the medium altogether, but it is deconstructive in its inquiry. So, finishing this digging up of artistic methodology from the debris of film theory, I would like to conclude on the work Gilbert Simondon, this notion of technical mentality, which I think is necessary in order to look complexly at the body of the technological apparatus, not as a separate tool, but as a sensitive artifact in a way, inheriting its qualities largely from its historical cultural context, but also from connection to the human body of the operator. So assuming in a way an approach that emphasizes function over the effect that the technology has on the viewer. In technical mentality, Simondon writes that technology does not recur to categories, and it leaves aside generic relations and special relations and specific differences. It kind of allows for the passage of one domain to another, and becomes as a transcategorical knowledge. And for him, he says, it's particularly fit to grasp the universality, which is an important word, I think, of a mode of activity, of a regime of operation. It leaves aside the problem of atemporal nature of beings and of the modes of real. It applies to their functionings. It tends towards a phenomenology of regimes of activity without an ontological presupposition that is relative to the nature of that which enters into activity. So on this, addressing the functioning of two apparatuses, of the human body and the filmic body, I'd like to now turn to the part about the film. And in the film, there will be three things to mention: movement walking, the mountain and the lines of sight, and movement camera. So now that we've found ourselves inside the map, and now that our human bodies are inscribed in it as some sort of absolute technologies on their own, how do they move? Or what kind of movement is accessible to us? Sergei Eisenstein wrote in a small essay, Montage in Architecture, around 1937-1940, an interesting description of Acropolis. He said that the Acropolis of Athens has an equal right to be called the perfect example of one of the most ancient films. It is a very peculiar, I think, description. He adds that it is hard to imagine a montage sequence for an architectural ensemble more subtly composed, shot by shot, than the one that our legs create by walking among the buildings of Acropolis. So Eisenstein here speaks as a sort of a filmic space, as a sort of architecturally constructed space. It is constructed through walking. The spectator is no longer immobile in a cinema theater, but the spectator walks through the film, as it were. The theorist Giuliano Bruna uses his article to establish this architectural space inside the film in order to show how film inherits this spectatorial voyage, if you want, from architecture. What I share with Bruno, I believe that the film constructs itself as an architectural space, even if it's a series of flat surfaces. For Eisenstein, it walks past in terms of montage, as a sort of a series of scenes, and it's always for him about montage. But I tend to think about it in terms of inclusion of the lines of sight in the architecture of the film. And even if we remember Vivian Sobczyk's account of film, she always says that the filmmaker, even when she talks about the filmmaker, she says the filmmaker looks through the camera at the world. And I would like to maybe point out here that the filmmaker may also look at the film that he or she is already making in the camera, while kind of into the architecture of the shot, which includes himself. An extreme example of this kind of manifesting itself would be a beautiful film by Adrian Fleury called A Place I've Never Been. Well, as you see, it's this Google Maps combined to present an uncanny, I think, space of which is just speaks for itself, to be honest. It's interesting to think about the choreography side also in feature filmmaking, because I think nowhere else it becomes as visible as there. The lines of sight, and this time it's the lines of sight of a spectator, they completely dictate the camera how to roll seamlessly through the set, in which every wall already is also constructed under the presumption of necessity. It only physically exists if it will be seen in the shot. And the necessity in its turn is defined by a long tradition of cinema's attraction. Back to walking, this kind of walking in a way without a purpose or without direction became significant to me as a thing in itself. In Russian, there is another curious word sharing kinship with astranение, and this word is stranичество, and it's used to denote the idea of pilgrimage without end, wandering without the final destination, because the final destination is the wandering itself. So I'm thinking now of walking as an operation for which the subject becomes unworlded. To wander without end inside was the fate of nymph Leto when she was, in Greek mythology, pregnant with Apollo and Artemis and pursued by Hera. She roamed the Mediterranean in order to find a place where she could safely give birth to her twins, and before eventually the island of Delos welcomed her. Prior to this event, the island, according to another myth, floated aimlessly in the Aegean. It was a floating island. But then it became anchored in its position by Poseidon, who made 4 granite columns rise out of the sea in order for it to become a safe haven for Leto. This is why actually the island came to be called Delos, which means visible, before which it was a floating nomadic rock. This island is now an archaeological site. Nobody lives there except for these beautiful statues. And there is a museum also. And that's where I'm going, hopefully, to film this feature film. This land, I think, for me, becomes a land without a subject. It's a land where these usual relations between the landscape and the person walking through it are fundamentally erased. And it's here where I'd like to turn to the mountain and the lines of sight. Mountains as another terrain, similar to the island, I think, in my head. But it was in the mountains that it occurred to me that if you think about the mountain as an expression of romantic sublime, this kind of 18th century romantic poetic sublime, then curiously it becomes dependent on you as a subject to walk far enough to include it in your lines of sight. Far enough for your lines of sight to kind of coincide with the outline with the mountain, but not too close, not too far. And for me, it reveals this interesting dimension which you can see the relation between the human and non-human in terms of scale, and how the sublime becomes a sort of a measure instrument for you to see your own fragility. This organization of movement in the mountains, I think, promotes inevitably a coming of going of perspective, this coming closer and backing away. If we think of a singular mountain, its gravity becomes the center point, and it starts to reorganize everything around it. As the filmmaker Hollis Frampton depicted the Japanese landscape, I can recall from my childhood a seeming infinitude of Japanese landscape photographs that included inevitably the image of Mount Fuji. Lately, I came to understand that Fujiyama is visible from absolutely every place in Japan, and that it looms from every direction at once. In this distant country, every single act of perception must indeed be fused inextricably with its proper coeval segment of an enterprise of the mind incomparably vast and continuous, the contemplation of the inevitable mountain. So, how does this relate to the camera movement and to the technological and human body? I'm thinking about the medical case from the 1960s I've read about an exhumation of a body of a projectionist with more than 25 years of experience, in which some rare earth minerals were found. Human body then again came to me as a sort of an obsolete technology, also underlining this human-non-human interaction, even within the seemingly heavy industrial production of feature films. And this relationship for me implies stepping back from the biological apparatus, from the fact that you have two eyes and you have two legs, and that you are bound to have a certain perspective. And if you addressed the mountain in terms of 3D camera view, this is the game, actually. This is an excerpt from it by David O'Reilly. In this game, you can basically control the mountain. Not the mountain, control the camera movement. And you are a mountain in a way. Nothing happens in the game. It just stays there. The time passes. It takes around 15 hours, I believe, for the game to finish. And when I say finish, the mountain, as you see, is in the space, and the only thing that happens in the game is are these like strange objects that come flying from space, and they end up on the mountain, and at some point it explodes, not being able to bear the weight. So this camera, which is for me already a de-anthropocentric camera, what kind of camera movements can we engage in when we walk through the map? I'm thinking about the vertical zoom that we so habitually kind of use in our phones to orientate yourselves. When we use it, we know where we are. We're pacified. Our mind is trained for this kind of temporality of 9 to 5 and 24/7. So when we have a precise information about where we are, we're immediately soothed. This vertical movement is what Alberto Toscano evokes in Cartographies of Absolute. Kind of thinking about descriptions of Alain René in Adam Pakula's film. This vertical zoom, and this film now I'm showing is called Powers of 10, sorry. It's seduction in its depiction of knowledge. It's this movement allows us to encompass the world, but it doesn't really. It just gives us an illusion. Toscano says that we become captivated by the fetishes of scale and precision, and then we become distracted from the world itself. I'll let it play in the background. But in thinking how to escape this kind of this inevitably human gaze, I'm always going back to Borges, to be honest. Borges, when he talks about this map of the empire, he describes that there is also a desert in which it's left to disintegrate when the map is not useful anymore. And it's curious for me that it has to be a desert in the first place, this kind of a land of beasts and beggars, as he calls it. And beasts and beggars as a sort of wanderers, reminds me of yet another quote by Plato about the polis, that the human that lives outside the polis, the human that can do without the polis has to be either a beast or a god. In terms of this desert becoming a locus of absence, while we can't completely erase the human body from the picture, I think it's interesting to think about this tactic of human absence, which we find in certain films, and we find in filmmaking as a way to disengage with these habitual movements of the camera that we reappropriate, the camera is not strange anymore to the vertical movement. And how to come back to the strangeness? I'm thinking about the work of Ian Chang called Emissary, the Forks of Perfection. Sadly, I can't show you the video, but it's a live simulation. The person, actually this human figure that you see in the center wanders through the background as a kind of a post-apocalyptic space followed by emissaries, by Shiba Inu dogs. And the camera, which is extremely interesting, I think, the camera moves around it randomly. So this live simulation is on the loop and it constructs itself each time differently. But then the camera is also completely random. It moves around it, it's not dependent on anything. And I'm thinking about, in terms of absence of the spectator also, if you don't think about the human that is present there to see a film, you stop orientating yourself, so you start dismantling this kind of usual coordinates. And I'm thinking that the camera in this film is extremely similar to another interesting phenomenon I found on YouTube recently. The cameras, GoPro cameras, lost at sea by the surfer owners. And they were miraculously found and returned back to the surfers. This one, sadly, again, this is an example of a film. Sorry. So the GoPro cameras, when you left them, of course, at their own to their own fate, they become completely disorientated again. I'm showing you here another film. Sorry to be speaking about two things at once, which is similar actually, because it just for a moment it eliminates the human subject from it. It eliminates it, just takes it. It flies, escapes with it. So this kind of space in which you don't have the control anymore, I think it's pretty wonderful in itself, and it introduces some strange temporality for us, strange movements that are completely unknown to us. And when you put them next to this wonderful octopus handling the camera, a relationship in which there's nothing human anymore. So this kind of, and this I think I'm combining what we just, what I said about there being a terrain of Borgesian map, but also a map for which you try to naively construct as an artist, working for your uncertainty. And the movements that are accessible to you, you start with the basic one, the walking, and you can engage for your apparatus with this different orientations that become accessible to you. I think it's very useful to remember that when you erase yourself, strange things start to happen. And when you trust the apparatus, strange things start to happen also. I'm gonna finish on this another video from the actual mountains that I mentioned last year. When you were walking through the mountains, encounters, I think, non-human entities start to happen. And I think it's fortunate that I'm ending on this animalistic note, because Philippa is going to be talking later on that, at least I hope. So that's what I ended with. Thank you.